This is the largest private residence ever built in the United States. It has over 4 acres of floor space, 250 rooms. It took 1,000 artisans 6 years to build it in 1895, and as you would expect, it's filled with treasures. Ah, isn't this civilized? A beautiful library, all built out of walnut, with over 10,000 volumes, most of them leather-bound. Now, I've looked, and I can't find any of my volumes. I can give them that. And how's that for a fireplace to sit by and read? That's George Washington Vanderbilt, the man who built this beautiful estate, and he looks down over the tapestry gallery. Ancient tapestries hang between these intricately carved limestone fireplaces. The furniture here is also heavily carved and a little bit ornate, not something we usually build in the New Yankee Workshop. Now, guests would stay here for a week or longer, so if you grew tired of reading or strolling in the garden and you wanted a little bit more violent exercise, you could head downstairs. There's plenty to keep you entertained here at the Biltmore Estate. Look at this, a solid oak ping pong table. Now, down this hallway, there's a nice sofa on one side and some photos on the other wall. A Roman emperor, a Roman athlete, and a Roman soldier, which should put you in the mood for some more serious athletics. Over here, we have a nice quarter-sawn oak floor that leads to 2 bowling lanes. Wooden bowling pins down at the other end, wooden bowling balls here. Now, if bowling isn't your thing, there's more. Wouldn't you like to have one of these in your house? A private indoor swimming pool, beautifully tiled with a wooden diving platform down the other end. A place you could hang out with your 50 closest friends. And if the water gets a little too chilly, you just come over here and add a little more hot. Now here we're talking about a real workout, pain. I could spend some time with the Indian clubs. After that, hit the rowing machine for a few miles, and then on to the weights. But I better think about taking a shower and getting ready for dinner. Well, after you've taken your shower, you're going to need a dressing room, and there are several of them here. This one has a piece that I really like. It's a cheval mirror, just like the one I built on the New Yankee Workshop a few years ago. But here's the piece I wanted you to see. It's a dressing table. On the top of it, we actually see some toiletries that belong to Cornelia Vanderbilt. Now, this is a 19th century reproduction of a Sheraton piece. The mirror folds into the top, and then the top comes down to conceal it and matches the rest of the top. It has a couple drawers and some turned and carved legs with brass casters on the bottom. This is a nicely sized piece for today's bedroom. So if you can't have the swimming pool or the bowling alley, you can have one of these. Well, here's our version of that dressing table. It's a close copy of the one that we found at Biltmore. Most people would consider this piece Federal or Sheraton, after Thomas Sheraton, the English cabinet maker who did his work in the late 18th and early 19th century. His pieces often featured vase-shaped legs. We were able to find some solid brass casters, just like the original, and some knobs for the drawer that were appropriate for a Sheraton piece. The top on the original was inlaid. Here we're using veneer core plywood. There's some nice features to this piece. The center section lifts up to reveal a mirror, which you can use while seated. But if you want, you can also pull the mirror out and prop it up in an angle to use it while standing. Before we do any woodworking, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Let me show you how I got started. Each leg has a square portion at the top and a turned portion the rest of the way. The first thing I want to do is make a score around all four sides of the blank to prevent tear out when I get to the lathe. So I've set up a stop block and the saw at a shallow cut. I'll guide the piece through with my miter gauge. With 8 legs to make for the prototype and the piece we're building today, I turned to my lathe duplicator. I made a template of the turning on a piece of hardboard and mounted it on the lathe duplicator. The way it works is that there is a cutter on this end and a follower down here. You keep moving closer and closer to the piece until the follower hits the template. It takes about 10 passes to turn a leg. If there's one disadvantage to the lathe duplicator, it's that the cutter is pointed, which means I can't get a perfectly square cut on the bottom of this portion. Now, I can do it with traditional tools, but I need a tool rest, which would mean I'd have to remove the duplicator if I want to do it from this side, and I don't want to do that. Fortunately, this lathe has a reverse function, so I can come over to the other side, set a tool rest, and complete the turning. One more thing that I want to do from this side is just tune up the very bottom of the leg, because I want to make sure that that brass foot is going to fit on before I sand everything down. And that will go on when I'm ready. So now we're ready for sanding. The rails of the table are going to be joined to the legs with mortise and tenon joinery. Each rail will have a tenon that fits into a mortise. To make these mortises, I'm using my stationary mortiser. You've seen me use this before. It has a 3/8" chisel, a drill bit in the middle. The drill does most of the work. The chisel squares it up. If you look here at the leg on the prototype, I want to show you a detail. There's this little rib. It's a half-round piece that runs around the leg and along the bottom edge of the rails. If I tried to attach such a small piece with brads, it would probably split. So I'm going to make a groove in the leg into which I can glue these pieces. To make that groove, I set up the dado head for 1/4 inch, installed the stop block, and attached another piece to my miter gauge to help guide it through. Here's one of those end rails. I've set up a stop block and adjusted the fence for a 1-inch long tenon. I'm going to use my miter gauge to guide the pieces through, making a shoulder cut on each side. Without changing the setup, I now want to make a shoulder cut on each edge of the solid pieces and nibble away the material right to the end. With the saw blade raised to a 1/2 inch, I'm going to make a saw cut on the top edges of the side rails and nibble away the material. Now for the cheek cuts. The best way to make cheek cuts for tenons is to use a tenoning jig like this one. It holds the piece securely so I can run it through the saw in a vertical position. Back at the mortising machine, this is a mortise in those front rails to receive the divider between the draws. Let's take another look at the prototype. If you look closely along this back edge, there's a solid piece of mahogany on top of the plywood rail because that edge shows when the mirror is open. So I've taken the back rail, rolled on some glue. I have a piece of solid mahogany that I'm going to attach with some brads. I've machined some tenons on a small piece of mahogany that will fit into those mortises that I just made to divide the drawers. Now let's take another look at the prototype. I've removed the drawers, and I'm going to remove this right side of the top so I could show you how it all goes together. There's a big piece of plywood in the middle for the work surface. There's 2 plywood cleats on each end, which will support and guide the drawers, as well as 1 in the middle. All these pieces are connected with biscuits. These notches on the drawer support allow it to fit around the legs. These solid pieces act as side guides for the drawers. Glue and brads hold them in place. This is the center support for the drawers, and 1 piece of plywood down the middle will guide both of them. Well, finally, we're ready for a little assembly. I'm applying a coat of glue to the tenon, and I've already put some glue in the mortise for the short rails. We'll clamp these up. Now a little glue on that divider between the drawers, and we'll clamp that up. All right. Now I'm putting all the parts together that we made those biscuit slots for. A little bit of glue in each biscuit slot and a number 10 biscuit. And this is that center panel. Goes in first. Okay. Now one of those end draw supports and guides. And here's the center support and guide. Here I've been applying glue in the mortises of the end assemblies I made earlier. We slip all these pieces together and clamp it up. All right. Pull that nice and tight together. Set it aside. Tomorrow's another day. Well, good morning. I got started today by working on some of the details of the base of our dressing table. I removed the clamps, sanded everything down, and now I'm installing this decorative rib or bead that goes all the way around the rails and the legs. The piece on the rails gets nailed on from underneath, but these tiny little pieces that fit around the legs are secured with glue only. And this is where that little groove that I machined in the leg comes in handy. It holds the piece at exactly the right height. And we just tap it in, clean off any glue, and that's all there is to it. Now let me show you how I made these bead pieces. The stock that I'm using for that bead starts out as 1/4 inch thick mahogany, a little bit wider than what I need. I've installed a 1/4 inch beading bit in the router, but I'm just using the half round portion. A feather board helps to keep the stock tight to the table. I just machine one edge. Now I can rip the pieces to the correct width. I've set the rip fence, and here it's absolutely critical to use a push stick for safety. Now I just take the piece I machined, slide it in the slot of the leg, then come down the other end, reach around, and put a mark at the back of that slot. And I like to cut all these pieces, both the square cuts and the miters, at the table saw with my miter gauge. I can see the marks better, especially on those really small pieces. It makes it a lot safer. With the piece in the right position, I want to mark the inside miter. And I found the best way to do that is to take a sharp pencil and just put a dot at the intersection. Back to the saw. Swing my miter gauge around to 45 degrees. and make the cuts. A little bit of glue on the edge of this trim piece, and slip it into the grooves and line it up. And here I will use some nails because they're on the underside and I won't see them. And the piece is wide enough so it won't split. Let's trim out this leg. Same bead, a narrower piece of stock. I've already cut a miter on one end, so I'll just slide the piece in up against the miter of the other piece and mark the length at the back of the groove. Now here's where a extension on my miter gauge helps. I can bring the mark up to the face, and you can see here I've made a pass through the saw, and I've drawn a line up exactly where the saw blade cuts. So now I bring the mark from the piece to the mark on the gauge, and I can cut that tiny little piece. Now there's still a tiny little splinter right on the edge there. I could trim that away with the utility knife. You can imagine how difficult and dangerous this would be to do at a power miter box. Now we just slip it in there, dry for the moment. Take another piece which has been mitered on one end. Get it in the right place. It's really just a matter of fit and cut. It takes a while. Now let's build a couple of drawers, and let me remind you of what they look like. They're all solid mahogany, and the sides are joined to the front with dovetails. The front is a piece of plywood wrapped in a very small 1/8 inch thick bead piece, just like the detail I did on the bottom of the rails and legs. I want to do that job first. Wrap the plywood. I can nail the long pieces, but the end pieces can only be installed with glue because I don't want to cut nails when I mill the dovetails. Here at the router table, I've switched over to a 1/16 inch radius round over bit or beading bit to make this delicate bead. I've carefully mitered all the pieces that wrap the piece of plywood for the draw front at the table saw. Now I've just rolled a bit of glue on the edge, and I just want to line up my corner and secure the long pieces with some brads. Now when it comes to these little short end pieces, just a little bit of glue, no nails, because that's where I'm going to machine the dovetails later. Okay, we'll just set this aside to dry. Let's take another look at the prototype draw. The back is joined to the sides in a dado joint. So I've set up the dado for a 1/2 inch width, 1/4 inch above the table, and I've set a stop block so I won't get any kickback when I run the pieces through. All 4 sides of the draw get a groove for the plywood bottom. It has to be a 1/4 inch wide, so I've reduced the width of the dado, and now I'll just run the pieces through. Now for the dovetails. We like to use a dovetailing jig. There are a series of fingers on the jig that I can adjust for just about any dovetail layout that I want. And by using that in conjunction with a router, which has a dovetailing bit, and a collar, which follows these fingers, I get perfectly fitting dovetails. I start with the side pieces, with the inside facing out. I make sure that there's a backer board behind the piece, and by following the fingers, I'll get the dovetails, and no tear out. Now I've installed the draw front in the top of the jig. And I've put this backer block in. Normally I don't put those in because I'm working with end grain on the draw front. But because I have this thin strip of trim, the rotation of the bit may cause it to tear away. So I'm fully backing it up. The next step is to take the jig and flip it over, which puts it in the pin mode. I slide it in and set it on the thickness of the side pieces, which in this case is a 1/2 inch, and then I'm ready to machine pins in the draw front. Now we're ready for some assembly, and all I need is glue with this type of joint. That's one of the nice advantages of a dovetail joint. There's a lot of glue surface to get around all these edges, and because of the shape of it, the draw front is not going to pull off of the side. You just slip the pieces together and wipe off the excess glue. Not only is it strong, but it looks great. With a little bit of glue in the dados for the back, I can slip in the bottom, which is not glued in place, just floats. And once that's in, we'll slip the back on and nail it. Okay, a few 1-inch brads will hold it all together. Okay, now we can take the assembled draws and slide them into the base. I want the front, that bead, to be about 1/8 of an inch beyond the rails and nice and straight. So I set both of them in place, and then I'm taking some scrap blocks of plywood, applying a little bit of glue, and I'm going to set those up on the supports right up against the side of the draw. One on each side will make sure they're in the right place. All right, well, that takes care of part 1 of our 2-part program to build the dressing table. It's coming along nicely. Now, next time, we'll make the top, the mirror assembly, do some finish, install the hardware, and we have a treat for you. We're going to show you how they make hardwood plywood, just like this mahogany. That's next time, right here in the New Yankee Workshop.